All right. Happy Friday. Welcome to the 23rd Automation Hour webinar. We're so happy to have you. I am here with Rakesh, and let's get started. All right, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, all lines will be muted, and please use the chat function to ask questions. It could be questions about this presentation or process automation questions in general. And if we're not able to get to your questions, let's continue to have that discussion out on our success community, Salesforce Automation Hour. And just to note that we will be posting the deck along with the recording after this session. So mention Salesforce Automation Hour, the success community. We also have a website, automationhour.com. So we are really excited for our upcoming series. We are booked through the early 2018, and this new series will have groupings by skill set. So our beginner series will start off 2 weeks from today with Eric Smith. Then we go into our intermediate series on October 13th with MVP Nana Gregg, and the advanced series in December. I can't believe I'm talking about December, with Sayer Martin. So the deck will be posted. You can click on the links there. They take you directly to the registration for the sessions, and also on automationhour.com for the link to upcoming webinars. You can also register via those links there. And we want to give a big shout out to Concrete.io for sponsoring this webinar series. Without them, we wouldn't be able to present all this great content to all of you. And your hosts, David, Rakesh, and I. This was taken most recently at our last event together, which was Selfie Streamin'. And hopefully the next time we get together, that will be Dreamforce 17. And Rakesh is offering discounts on his printed as well as his ebooks. So that's 15% and 50% off. Again, if you don't take the screenshot right now, they'll be available in the deck as well as the recording after the fact. And I will be presenting today's Automation Hour. Very excited for that. So for those who don't know me, I'm a Salesforce business consultant at John Hancock. I'm also a Salesforce MVP. I blog about Salesforce at jenwlee.wordpress.com, where I post a lot of how-tos on Process Builder and Flow. I've also presented at multiple Salesforce events or Salesforce regional events, Dreamforce, last year's Dreamforce, Boston and New York World Tours, Southeast Dreamin', and several Salesforce user groups. I'm also a self-proclaimed Trailhead addict. I have all the badges except for one, which I need to work on. That's the Data Integration Super Badge. I'm also the social media manager for Women in Tech Diversity. Our Twitter handle is WIT_diversity, and my personal Twitter handle is @JenWlee. So hopefully you're here for the beginner session for visual workflow. I know when I learned visual flow, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, there really wasn't much content out there. Salesforce didn't provide robust documentation on flow. I think they only had like one example. So at that time, I had to Google flow and found some great resources. Rakesh was one of them, Automation Champion. I also use Wizard News, which is MVP Brian Kwong and Mark Ross's site, to use those use cases, and I'm more of a hands-on person, so I need to go step by step to figure things out. But those were great resources at the time before there was Trailhead and all these other great blog sites out there. I do have to say that learning flow isn't quite as easy as learning Process Builder. It did take a learning curve for me, at least. So if you're out there and you've tried to use flow a couple of times and it doesn't resonate, don't be discouraged, because even for myself, it took a couple of tries before I got the hang of it. So if it doesn't click the first time, second time, third time, be persistent, because you will eventually get it. And just to note, once you start going into Flow, that gives you a natural transition to the developer side of things, because you'll be using variables and things like that that you would use as a developer. So when I got accepted into the Rad Woman program, that was a natural transition for me, because I understood those pieces in Flow. All right. So here's what we're going to cover off on today. What is Flow? How do I invoke it? What's Cloud Designer? And I'm going to go through some solutions in using Flow. We're going to do screen interactions with the user, how to embed and invoke Flow via a Lightning page, from a button or a link, from a Visualforce page, from Process Builder. And then I'm going to end with 10 tips and tricks. All right, so what is visual workflow? It allows you to automate business processes, and you can see them visually on the screen, and this is a worked flow that I built. You can have users interact with Flow via screens that you configure, or it could just run in the background. And the cool thing about Flow is that you could have actions run on multiple objects, whether they're standard objects or custom objects within one process. And I always consider Flow as Process Builder's bigger brother. Like in most cases, you can start with Process Builder, but then if you need more complex processes to run, that's when I'll hand it off into Flow to do some of the more complex querying and looping and the fast lookups and all that. And the other cool thing that Flow can do that Process Builder and traditional workflows can't do is delete records. So the ways that you can invoke Flow, you can use Process Builder, and that will start when a record is created or updated. You can also access Flow via a custom button or a link, and that's when that button or link is clicked. And you can also access it via Visualforce or a Lightning page, and that's when the page is accessed by the user. So let's take a look at Cloud Designer. And Cloud Designer is basically the UI into Visual Workflow. This, again, is an example of something that I've configured. But when you start off with creating a new flow, the area right here is in the middle where I have record lookups and all those boxes. That's basically a blank canvas where you can drag and drop those boxes and configure your business process accordingly. Okay, so let's start off with the basics. Your flow should have at least one variable. And what is a variable? I consider it like a container that holds a value that you'll use at some point in your flow. So picture a Tupperware container, right? And there are different variables that you can use in Flow. So there's a variable, which is a single value. So let's pretend that the variable is an apple that you hold in that Tupperware container. Or you can hold a collection variable, which are multiple updatable values of that same data type, a group of email addresses, what have you. So those are multiple apples in a Tupperware container. Then you have SObject variable and SObject collection variables, and that's where you're pulling back one or more Salesforce records, and you're able to update the field values of that, that record or the multiple Salesforce records. Now, when you configure any of those four variables that I just talked about, you'll need to specify the data type. So you could indicate whether it's a text, number, currency, date, date time, a checkbox, or single or multi-select pick list. You also need to specify the input and output type, and this tells Flow how you are expecting to access the variable. So if you mark something as private, that means a variable can only be used within your given flow. Input only means that you're expecting the value or can expect the value to be passed into the flow externally from a Visualforce page, another flow, or process builder. And then output only is if you have a value that you're working with in a variable in your flow, you could then pass it outward outside of your flow into another Visualforce controller or another flow. And lastly, you could do input and output. So if you're just getting the hang of things, I would suggest to give yourself the maximum flexibility is to indicate input and output type. So you don't even have to know when you're configuring that variable, whether you want it just to be used within your flow, if you want to send values in or not. So input and output, greatest flexibility. All right, some other resources that your flow offers in addition to the 4 variables that I talked about. There is a thing called constant. So this is a value that you'll reference in your flow, but it doesn't change. It's a static value. Formula is just like how you use formula elsewhere in Salesforce, whether it's a formula field or a formula in a validation role, same concept here. Text template allows you to store HTML formatted text, bolding, and whatnot. So you might use that in displaying text on the user screen or in an email that you send off via your flow. And then the 3 choices are used for your screens. So a choice is a radio button. Dynamic record choice allows you to specify the object, for example, opportunity. And you can specify to pull in the pick list values for the stage name as opposed to statically creating them in the flow. And then pick list choice, you can select from a single to a multi-select pick list. Okay, some more things with Cloud Designer. So we're in the Palette tab, and within that you could drag and drop these elements into your blank canvas to configure. So under user interface, screen is pretty self-explanatory. You have a blank screen and you're just configuring it to show text, radio buttons, text boxes, what have you, whatever your business requirement is for the screen. Logic, under there you have decision. So that allows you to set up various conditions, and if those conditions are met, then you could route the process multiple ways in your flow. So that's equivalent to an if-then statement. And then you have assignment and looping. So those are the more complex flow topics, which I'm not really going to cover off on today because we're really focused on the basics, but know that you have those as part of flow. So an example of looping and assignments, let's say we were manufacturing cars, and you go into a loop, you have a collection of cars, and in the loop you want to assign a license plate and a color to your car. So those would be assignments. One would be assignment of a license plate number and then the car color. And then once you get out of the loop, because they'll go through for how many cars you have in your collection, once you get out of the loop, then you could perform tasks on there, like actually coloring the car and giving the license plate assignment. And lastly, there's wait. So that is equivalent to a time-based workflow or a scheduled action and process builder. So your flow will continue on to the different boxes until it gets to the wait. And you can specify whether it waits a specific time or like an absolute time in terms of like 30 minutes or whatever, and then moves on, or a specific criteria within your flow to then move on. Now for data, you have the ability to do record create, update, lookups, and deletes, and those are off of specific values for record. And then there's the fast equivalent, so you have the fast create, fast update, fast lookup, and deletes, and those are on a collection of Salesforce records, one or more Salesforce records. Lastly, we can also pull in another flow into your flow. And the reason why you would want to do that is if you are, as you're getting more advanced, right, if you're finding that you're needing to configure the same steps over and over again, it probably makes sense to create your own separate flow for that and then just call it into your other flows. As literally you're finding your flow and then you're dragging and dropping it into your process. And the cool thing about that is if you ever need to make a change to that one flow, you're going in that one specific flow and making the change, and it will replicate everywhere that you're pulling in that flow into another flow. So think of it as, you know, Word. You have a document. You don't want to go ahead and clone your Word documents multiple times, because if you have a change to that content now, you're going into each clone to update, versus think of it as a pointer. You're also able to pull in Apex that has an invocable method. And for quick actions, you have the ability to pull in a create, update, or log a call, object-specific or global quick action. And then we also have the ability to post to Chatter, send an email, and submit a record for approval. All right, so now we're going to go into the various use cases for using Flow. So our first user story is there is a limited time cross-sell promotion on a new product. So what we want the customer service reps to do when they're servicing an account is to recommend a product via a series of screens to the customer. So in our high-level design, we're going to create a flow that allows the user to interact with the screen. So this is the customer service rep. We're going to ask for the customer's interest in the product. And then if they're interested, behind the scenes, we're going to create a product opportunity to be tracked. And then we're also going to thank the customer for their business, regardless of whether they're interested in the product or not. So in the flow, you'll see the screen, then you'll see a decision box. Are they interested in the product? And then the no arrow goes down to the screen where we thank them for their business. The yes arrow goes over to a record lookup, where we're going to look up the account name because we want a consistent naming convention in our opportunities that we're going to create in the record create flow element. And then after we're done doing that, it's going to go to the screen that thanks the customer for their business. All right, so we're going to create the variables right now. So variable record ID is going to be the account record ID, and it's input only. We're going to pass it in. And then the variable account name, which will store the account name that we're going to look up. And that we're having indicated as private because we're just going to use it within our flow. Now we're going to create the screen. So we're going to drag the screen over to the main canvas. And then we're going to give it a name. And the name is going to show up in the UI in Salesforce to the customer service rep. And I always like putting descriptions wherever description fields in Salesforce. And we're going to say, don't show the previous button, and we're going to deselect the show pause button. Now we're going to tab over to the add a field, and here's where you could configure what shows up on the screen. So we're going to drag the display text, and we're going to drag a radio button. Then in the display text, we're going to double click, and we're going to give our text a unique name. And then here is the formatted HTML text that you can put in. Now we're going to configure the radio button. We're going to call it interested in new product, question mark. and we're going to make this field required. And now we're going to set up the choice. So it's the radio button where we're going to set up yes or no. All right. So following, we're going to create our decision. And this is where we determine whether the customer is interested in the product or not. Again, I like putting descriptions to describe what the decision is. And here, yes is the outcome. And because we only, so then screen choice field, we're going to select the selection from the screen equals to yes. So that indicates that the customer is interested in a product. And for the default outcome, since it's only no is our only other option, I'm not going to configure conditions for that. I'm just going to say it defaults to no. Next, we're going to create the thank you screen and the record lookup. So here we're configuring the screen, giving it a description. We're going to deselect the show pause button and don't show previous button. And in the add a field, we're going to drag a display text. We're going to give it a unique name, and this has to be unique from the other text field that we created in our first screen. So now we're going to do the record lookup, and this is because we know the account ID that we have. It's going to be invoked from a record page. We're going to look up the account name that's associated with that account ID. So give it a description. And then we're going to look up the account object. So start typing ACC and it will pop up the various objects. And here the field that we're going to look up is ID equals and our variable record ID. Now we're going to scroll down a little, and for the fields, we're going to take the name field, and we're going to put that value into the variable account name. So now we're going to do the record, go back, the record create. So drag the record create box, and here's where we're going to create the product opportunity. Give it a description. And here under create, we're going to select opportunity. And now we're going to set up for fields for our opportunity that we're creating. So we're going to have the account ID, the close date, the name, and the stage name. So account ID, we're going to pull the variable record ID. Close date, I want to set a formula because I don't want a static date. And put in a description. So it's today's date plus 3 days, and it's going to be a date field. So we're changing from text to date, and it's going to be today, open, close, paren, plus 3. For the name, we're giving it a standard naming convention. So again, I'm going to use a formula here, and it's going to be product ABC plus the account name. And lastly, for the stage name, it picks up the stage pick list from the opportunity. One thing to note when you're doing record creates is you need to know what fields you have required on that object, and you need to configure them accordingly in your record create, because if you miss a required field or it's not following a specific convention, then it might throw a validation error, or it'll say your flow will fault because it's looking for required fields that you did not configure in your record create. All right, and then lastly, we're going to set the start element. So this tells the flow which box to start with. And so you double click on that, and then you see that green circle there. So that says this screen is the first piece in your flow. Then you go draw connectors. So it's literally from one box to another. And this tells it, okay, when I'm done with this flow element, what flow element to go to next. So now we're drawing from a decision to the screen. And here it shows the outcomes that we configured. So we're going to select the no, because if the customer isn't interested in the product, we're just going to show the thank you screen. And now we're going to select the connector from decision to record lookup, and because there's only one option left, it selected yes as a default, and then record lookup to create, and then the record create to the screen. And then once you're done with that, you save your flow, give it a description, and remember to activate it after the fact, or it won't run in your org. Okay, so that was our first use case. So moving on to the next one, where we're invoking flow from a Lightning page. So we want to show the cross-sell flow that we just configured on the account detail page in Lightning Experience. So our high-level design, we're going to embed the flow on the account detail page in Lightning. So here we go. We're on the account detail page. We hit Edit Page. This brings up Lightning App Builder. We then go select Flow from the standard components, drag it to wherever you want the screen to show. Then we're going to click on that, and over at the side panel, it'll show all the flows that we have that have a screen interaction. So we're going to select Cross-Sell, and then we're going to check the box for record ID. And what that does is once it executes the flow, it's going to pass that account ID over to our flow. And one thing to note about that is that naming convention of that variable, record ID, needs to be exact for it to pass from the flow component onto your actual flow. All right, so 2 down, a couple more to go. We're now going to invoke flow from a button or a link. So our user story here is, as a customer service rep, I would like to assign a case record to me in one click. So for those who use case management, you know when you click the change owner link, and then if you have queues set up in your org, you then have to select between the user or the queue, and then you have to type in and search for the user in the queue. Now, if you're lucky enough, like me, to have another person in your org named Jennifer Lee, then you have to select among the 2 Jennifer Lees which one you want to assign the case to. So as it is, that was a lot of multiple steps, and a customer service rep, when they're on the phone with a customer, they want to be able to do things quickly. So I want to be able to click a button, and then because you know I'm on that page, you know I'm logged in as me, you should be able to assign the case directly to me. So our flow only has one flow component. That's the record update, which will change the case owner to the current user upon click. Then we're going to create a custom button and add it to the detail page, and it will basically execute the flow, pass in 2 variables, and then once it's done, it'll take you back to the lead detail page that we were on. And then we need to add the button to the appropriate page layout for it to appear. So we're going to create the variables, var current user ID, and this stores the ID of the current user that's on the page, input only. And then we're going to create a variable var lead ID, and that's the lead ID that we're going to pass input only. So we're going to create our record update, the one flow element. So we're going to call it assign a lead to me, give it a description. We're going to update the case, the lead object, where the ID equals the variable lead ID. And then we're going to update the owner ID field with the other variable var current user ID. And then once you're done, you double click that to make that the starting point, and then there's no connectors. So you then save, give it a description, give it a name, and then remember to activate that flow. So our next step here is to create that custom button. I like giving my buttons a description as to what it does. I note the flow name that it invokes. So we're going to select Detail Page Button. The behavior is opens an existing window without a sidebar or header, and it's a URL. So in the URL, it starts off with /flow/assign_a_lead to me. And where I got that is on your flow, once you save it, there's a URL, and you're just going to literally copy and paste that into the button area. And then if you want to pass variables, data into the variables, you have the question mark and then bar lead ID. That's going to be case sensitive, exactly how you named it in your flow, equals, and then you'll have the merge field lead ID, so that's the ID from the lead object. If you're passing on a second or multiple variables, you're going to have the ampersand, and then the exact name of your second variable, so in this case it's var current user ID equals, and then we have the merge field ID from the user object. And then at the end here, I have ampersand, RET, URL equals / and then the merge ID field from the lead object. And this tells it, once I'm done with the action of my flow, take me back to the lead ID, the lead record page. All right, so on to our next user story. We're now going to invoke flow from a Visualforce page. So when our account with the record type A is deleted, we're going to send an email to Addison Dogster. Addison Dogster is the system admin at Universal Containers. Otherwise, if it's not record type A, it's some other record type, we're just going to go ahead and delete the account. No one needs to be notified. So our high-level design is we're going to create a flow that performs the record delete. Then we're going to have a decision to determine whether the account's record type is equal to A. And if it is, then we're going to send an email to Addison Dogster. We're also going to override the standard delete button with this Visualforce page. Then we're going to create a Visualforce page to execute the flow, and we're going to pass over parameters such as the account ID, the account name, and the account record type to the flow. Because we're going to be on the account record page, we already know this information. Salesforce already knows the ID, name, and record type. So there's no need to do the lookup in your flow. We're just going to pass that information in. And here, I'm also introducing custom labels to store the account record type AID. So I'm going to do a little sidebar here where best practice, do not hard code IDs into your flow. Don't do it in Process Builder. Don't do it in validation rules. It's just a bad practice overall. You don't do it in code either. And the reason being is, especially if you're creating something net new in a sandbox, it's going to have a different ID. So when you start moving up the change from your dev sandbox to your full copy sandbox to production, I guarantee you the IDs will not be the same. The only time they're the same is if you take it from production and then refresh them. So if you are to hard code IDs in your sandbox and you move up your flow into your full copy sandbox, into production, then you're going to have a manual step where you're going to need to save a new version of that flow, update the ID to whatever the ID is of that full copy sandbox or prod, and now you have different versions of your flow floating out there. So what I like to do is have those IDs reside outside your flow, outside your process builder, your validation rules, your code, into something like a custom label, custom setting, custom metadata type. For this example, I'm going to choose a custom label. And that way, you could update the IDs in the custom label without ever having to touch your flow. So your flow will have the same version in all the sandboxes, full copy, and production. So we're going to show you how to do that. All right, so Here, we're on the record type A, and we're copying the 15 characters. We're going to put it into a tool that converts it from 15 to 18 characters. We're going to copy that 18 character ID for the record type, and we're going to put it into the custom label value field. Now in our flow as a formula, we're going to pull that custom label. So under System and Global Variables, we're going to look for $label, and that's where all your custom labels will live for you to point to. So now we've just did that piece where I'm calling whatever the ID into my flow, and I'm not hard coding IDs. So next we're going to configure the other variables. So var account ID, we're going to do input only because we're passing it in from our Visualforce page in. I have an account name, text input only, and current username, record type, sorry, input only. And okay, current username. So here I want to show a specific format. So I want the user's first name and last name. So in the box, I'm going to type $user, and that will pull fields from the user object. And then I get to select from the list of fields, so I'm going to look for the first name field. Then I want plus, and then I'm going to have a quote with a space and a quote because I don't want my first name, last name squished up. And then now I'm going to do $user again, and then I'm going to locate the last name field. All right, and then the last piece that I'm going to configure is the email text that I'm going to send to Addison Dogster. So this is the email body that we're talking about here. So I want to pull in my current name formula, and then I'm going to type in static text, deleted account, and then I'm going to pull in the variable account name. So I'm just going to type in the box account, and then I could pick from the list that's returned. All right, so then we're going to configure a record delete off of the account where the ID equals the variable account ID that we're passing from our Visualforce page into Flow. Then we're going to determine the record type, and I only have one outcome here, which is the record type A, and my condition here is the variable account record type equals, and that's the custom label formula that we're pulling in. And then send email, we're going to configure the body to look at that email text template that we just configured, and the subject will be the account name has been deleted. And then we need to select email address and type in Addison Dogster's email address. And then once we're done, set the count delete to the starting element, so double click and make sure the little green circle appears, and then draw the connectors. Then save your flow, give it a description, and then remember to activate it after the fact. Okay, so for the email that is sent, GenTest has been deleted. The GenTest is the account name that we were able to pull in, and then in the email body, Jennifer Lee deleted the account GenTest. So that came from that current name, username formula that we configured with that email text, deleted account, and then the account name. Now we're going to create the Visualforce page, and I hope I don't lose my admins out there, because while it might look scary, it really isn't. Once you have the code, you could copy and paste and tweak. There's nothing wrong in that. You don't need to create code from scratch, right? So let me explain what's going on. with the Visualforce page. So this says that it's a Visualforce page, Apex page. Standard controller here equals, and this is the object you're going to run your flow on. In our case, it's the count object. So any standard objects are the straight name of that object. If you're pulling in a custom object, you're going to need the API name. So it's whatever it is, _ _c. Then the next line, flow : interview. That tells it I'm going to invoke a flow. The name is the API name of your flow, so that in our case it's delete _ and _ count. And then the finished location is where you want to take the user after your flow executes on from your Visualforce page. So in this case, I'm saying after I'm done, return it to the count home page. And here, if you're in Classic, you can just navigate to the home page, look at the URL, and then account is 001. Opportunity always has the same 3 digits. So you just navigate to the page and just copy and paste it into your code here. And then the next 3 parameters are what you're passing over into your flow. So we have the var account ID, var account name, var account record type. Remember, those need to be case sensitive to what you called it in your flow. And then you just go pass over values using the merge fields that you set up. So it's the ID from the count object, the name from the count object, and the record type from the count object. And then it tells it to end the interview, end the flow, and then end the page. And then that's essentially it. So copy and paste it and tweak accordingly. That's all the code you need to know. All right, so now we're going to override the delete button, and it's literally just say Visualforce page, here's the Visualforce page, and that's all there is. So that when a person clicks on delete, it goes to the Visualforce page that invokes your flow versus uses the standard out-of-the-box delete function. All right, so I believe this is our last one, invoke flow from Process Builder. So our user story is there's a new or existing user's department has changed to finance. We're going to assign the export reports permission set so we don't have to do it manually. So our flow has us doing a record lookup of the permission set ID by passing in the API name of the permission set. That's another way you can work around hard coding IDs, is to actually look it up as part of your flow. Then we're going to look up to see if the user already has that permission set, because what we don't want to do is try and assign them that permission set that they already have. So if you were to do it in the Salesforce interface, you would get an error. Well, you actually can't even do it. But if Flow were to do it, you get an error saying that it's a duplicate permission set. You can't assign more than this, the one to the user. So our next decision needs to do a check to ensure that the user does not already have a permission set. And if they don't, then we're going to assign that permission set to the user. So here we're going to set parameters of our permission set ID. This will store the ID that we're going to look up. The next one is var permission set name. That's the API name that we're going to pass from Process Builder. And we're going to do input only so that it gets passed in. Then variable var user has permission set. So this is our indicator whether the user has been assigned that permission set. And var user ID that we will pass over from Process Builder. So it has to be input only. Then next, we're going to move on to the record lookup, where Process Builder is going to pass the permission set API name, and we're going to look up the ID. So once we have the ID, we're going to store it in the variable permission set ID. And here you want to check the box for assign null if it doesn't find any. So our next step is to look up the permission set assignment to see if that user is assigned to that permission set ID. And then we're going to take the assignee ID value and assign it to that variable var user has permission set. Again, we're going to check the box, assign null values if no records are found. Our next decision is have no permission set. So var user's permission set is null. And then we're going to, in the next step, assign that permission set to the user. Okay, so in our process builder, we're going to have it run off of the user object when the record is created or edited. We only have one criteria node here, and that's, we're going to call it new or existing finance user. Here I'm going to use a formula because we can't specify via the clicks that a record is new. So let me explain the formula. So it's is new and the user's department equals finance, or the user's department has changed and the user's department is now finance. Then under our immediate action, we are going to invoke a flow. So I gave it a name and pulled in the flow that we just created, add user to permission set. And I'm going to pass over two variables, the user ID into the variable var user ID, and export underscore report is the API name of the permission set, and I'm going to pass it into the variable permission set name. And then that's it for my process, so remember to activate it after the fact as well as the flow. All right, so we're done with our user stories. So I wanted to also cover off on 10 tips and tricks. They're in no particular order. So a flow can only perform an operation if the running user has permission to do so. So in your flow, you might have a record create, update, or delete. You need to make sure that the person running the flow has those permissions to that object. Because if they don't, then the user will get an error, insufficient privileges, and it can't execute the flow. So you either give the user that permission via their profile or a permission set. As you're beginning, I would recommend that you plan before you build. Don't just go into Salesforce and start configuring. This is a highly complex one that I did, but the point is think about all the actions that you need to do, whether it's a record lookup, create, a decision, and just draw it out, because it's easier to erase and draw again on paper than it is if you spent the time configuring it and now you have to refactor and it takes time to do so. Okay, 3. Although you could create flows directly in production, does not mean you should create them in production. And the reason being is as you're going through flow, I don't know anyone who creates flow perfectly from the get-go, right? So now you're configuring flow, you're testing it, and you're manipulating production data and potentially making them inaccurate, right? So what you want to do is test it in an environment with test data, make sure it works, then promote it up via chain set or whatever your process is of moving configuration items up to production. Save often. Flow design, Cloud Designer is not like Word where it has an auto-save function. So I've done this to myself several times too, is I will spend time configuring my flow, it'd be perfect, and then I shut it down and I notice that I didn't save. And now I have to go back and redo. So as you're going through flow, just keep hitting the save button. 5, when you're working on flow, start thinking like a developer. Think of ways to keep your flow from faulting and getting that nasty message. So a couple of tips around that, and you saw examples of this in the ones that I configured, is when there are, when you're doing a query and it doesn't find the records, check the box that says assign null values to your variables if no records are found, or else it's going to fault in your next steps. Also, if a field that you're using is optional, add a condition to check that the field is not null. And then along the same lines as the previous one, perform null checks. So when it comes to decision elements, more the better. When you're doing a query or you're doing a fast lookup, any type of lookup where you're pulling in a collection of things, make sure there's something in that collection, because there's no point in trying to do a record create or update if there's nothing in that collection to do anything with. So that's why in this example I have products found. There's an S collection, is null false. That means 2 negatives make a positive. There's a value in there. And then let's continue on. 7, never hard code ID references. I think I talked about that. Use custom labels, custom metadata types, custom settings. I wrote a blog post on that. And when you're doing lookups, alternatively, you can do lookups using a record name, and I would recommend using the API name or the developer name, because that's less likely to change, to then look up the ID so you're not storing it in your flow. Number 8, users need the run flows system permission to execute flows, so make sure that's on the profile or permission set that's assigned to the user. Number 9, use flow elements. I kept the flows that I showed you today simple, but you should consider using fault connectors. So anytime you're doing a database execution, whether that's a lookup, create, delete, or lookup, create, update, there's chances that the system's not going to be able to do what it's doing, whether it's a lookup because it couldn't find any records, or it wasn't able to do delete or create the record. Then with these fault connectors that have the word fault in them, what we do at John Hancock as best practice is we're calling another flow that basically sends an email to production support that says, hey, someone trying to do something with this flow and it didn't go as expected, so that someone can look at it behind the scenes. And the way that you're able to configure the fault connector is it's the second line that you draw off of any given box. So I have 2 links to a blog post that talk through how to do that. And then 10, if you're using chain sets to deploy your flow as well as process builder, you're going to find them under the category flow definition. And to note that they do deploy to sandbox or production inactive, so you do have to remember to take that step to activate your flow. All right, and then I want to give you some resources. There's Trailhead. There's 3 projects that you can do that take you step by step in doing different projects with flow. There are success communities, so as you're building your flow, you have issues, definitely post to them. There's always people willing to jump in and help out. So there's the Salesforce Workflow Automation, Visual Workflow Discussions, and Salesforce Automation Hour. And I also provided the blogs for the 3 of us, Jen W. Lee, WordPress.com, AutomationChampion.com, Rakesh's, and David's blog, SalesforceSidekick.com. And if you're interested in learning about loops and assignments, Pete Fife did a really good automation hour that talked through that topic, so the link in the deck will take you there as well. So that's a recap of what we learned today, and that's essentially it. So go off and create your flows. All right, Rakesh, what do we have for questions?
Oh, right now, okay. So Stucky says that, thank you so much. Okay, so right now we don't have any questions in queue.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Too many thank yous, Jen. Good.
All right, so we'll post the deck as well as the recording, and as you go through and learn your new flows, if you have questions, see us on the Success Community Salesforce Automation Hour. And thanks so much.